Okay, so good. You can hear me. So we've been working on syntax. We started syntax, and syntax was already the elementaries of syntax were already part of your test number 2, right? And we will continue for a few days with syntax still. And for what is important to learn before we can kind of start looking at how syntax works, we will need to do a quick overview of those parts of speech which are called in linguistics usually lexical categories. And we started that last time, and we went over that silly sentence which showed that our brains are able to decipher the structure of the sentence and the structure of the sentence, even if we don't know the words in that particular sentence, all the words. Because every single day we encounter words that we don't use meaning, we don't know. And yet our brain is able to allow us to get some kind of an idea of what that sentence means. And that's because we can assign the words into their proper categories of nouns, verbs, adjectives, and adverbs based on 2 different criteria. And we talked about those criteria last time. We used those criteria subconsciously. Our brain kind of, uses them in order for us to know that, okay, that's a verb and not a noun. So what are those 2 criteria that we use? When we look at the placing of the word within the sentence structure, is that a morphological or syntactic criteria? Syntactic, exactly. And morphological criterion is then what? What are we looking at when we look for the morphological? When we use the morphological criteria in order to understand what the part of speech of the word is, what do we do? We look at the word itself, right? So we look at the kind of morphemes that are included in that word, or which that word has attached to it, like affixes. So so that way we are able to place the words into the correct form classes. And what are the 4 form classes? Just a quick overview. Yeah, so we've got nouns, we've got verbs, we've got adjectives, and we've got adverbs. And why are these called form classes? Because they can change their form, right, by taking inflectional suffixes. Now, remember, in English, all the inflectional morphemes are suffixes. They come at the end of the word. So those are the morphological cues that we can use when we want to define the part of speech of the word. Of course, there's some overlap in the overt forms of some of the inflectional suffixes. English has 8, and the s or z or its other allomorphs appear as the plural, as also the possessive, in writing we have the apostrophe to help us, but not when we just decipher speech. And also as the third person singular present tense marker for verbs. So we need to look at the sentence, the word also in its context. So you can look at the morphological structure, which inflectional morphemes it takes, and then where in the sentence it appears, what comes before, what comes after. We can also, when we use the morphological criteria, we can also look at the derivational morphemes that a word takes. Like, for instance, if there's a word that ends in ment, what is the class? What part of speech does it belong to? Of these four? Nouns, yes. And if there's an ending, eyes, or if I, what is the part of speech then?
Verb.
It's a verb, yes. So these are derivational affixes, and they can be also prefixes. Derivational ones can be also prefixes. So the reason why we did morphology first before we do syntax is that we actually use morphology in order to decipher the structure of the sentence. So then the syntactic criteria are when we look at the elements that signal or come together with these form class words. So we have function words. These are the grammatical words that allow us to identify that, hey, this word is a noun, it's a verb, it's something else. So what are the function elements, function words that signal nouns?
Determiners.
Yes, determiners. So if we have a noun or a word like house, and we are not sure whether it's a noun or something else, because it could be a verb too. We can look if it's preceded by a determiner, like, you know, we can put in here the, this, that, one, and so on. If it's houses, then many, these, those, and 10 houses. But these are determiners, and they signal that the noun is coming. Okay. Then there is a category that can go between the determiner and the noun. And what is that category? Can we put a verb there between the determiner and the noun? No. Can we put an adjective there? Yes. So if we put a red house, a large house, and whatever adjective you want to put it, it would come in this slot. And this gives us the rule for the noun phrase, the grammatical structure of the noun phrase. So a noun phrase is, noun phrase rewrites or is interpreted or is interpreted as the following kind of a structure. So today we'll talk about phrases, because that's kind of the unit that is very, very important for syntax. Our brains identify this phrasal structure in the sentence and helps us to. So a sentence is not just a string of words. Those words are organized in a hierarchical structure, in a phrase structure. And that's why we talk about phrase structure rules. So the noun phrase rule is such that there's got to be one element in order for something to be a noun phrase, and that is the element of the noun. So phrases, they get their names by the most important word in that phrase, and that's called the head of the phrase. So the noun is the head of the noun phrase. Noun phrase is called a noun phrase because its most important word or its head is a noun. So, so the noun phrase must have a noun. It can have a determiner, and we did some of this already. And it can also have an adjective coming between the determiner and the noun, or multiple adjectives, actually. So, so these parentheses, what do they mean? That this element is not obligatory, it's optional. We can have it or we don't have it. So in the case of the word house, it needs to have some kind of a determiner in front of it. But if we have a person's name, for instance, Mary, Mary does not get a determiner typically in front of it. So, so a one noun, like a proper name, that can be the entire noun phrase. All right. So the function words are determiners. They signal nouns. And what is the category of function words that signals verbs? Just a quick review here.
Auxiliaries.
Oh, yes. Auxiliaries. Yeah. And there are modal auxiliaries like can, could, may, might, will, would, shall, should, must. And then there are also other kinds of auxiliaries, very few though, like be is an auxiliary, like I am talking, and have, I have talked. So be and have can also function as auxiliaries, even though they can also function as the main verbs in a sentence. So function words, they have these signaling functions, and then we have other kinds of function words, such as prepositions. And prepositions actually also have a signaling function. They don't signal a single noun, but they signal a noun phrase. Like if we have the noun phrase, the house, consisting of a determiner and a noun, and then whatever we put in front here, it will be a preposition, right? You know, of course, it can be something else too, like a verb, like I bought the house. It could be a verb. But if it's a preposition, it comes in front of the entire noun phrase. So this is, what is it? Noun phrase, referred to as an NP. And let's try what kinds of prepositions we can put in there. In the house, to the house, from the house, behind the house, under the house, and so on. So prepositions also have a signaling function. They signal an entire noun phrase. Then we have conjunctions, different kinds of conjunctions, like coordinating and subordinating conjunctions. And they don't have signaling functions, but they have combining functions, conjoining functions. Their job is to conjoin different elements in the sentence, like Mary and John, and is combining two different noun phrases, and that's their job. Okay, so so that's just a quick list of the very important function words, and let's move on to talk about the phrases and constituents. So if we have a sentence, like this one here, okay, so what we have here is a relatively long sentence, and it consists, of course, of words. And let's just identify all the words in this sentence in terms of their part of speech, the lexical category. So here we have what is the it's a definite article, so we will call it what? Starts with a D. So we'll call it a determiner. And because it's a determiner, what is this?
A noun.
It's a noun. Determiner signal nouns. What is of? Here's the determiner. So this is a determiner. This must be what?
A noun.
A noun. There could be an adjective in between, but now we don't have. Okay, so what we have is determiner plus noun. It's a noun phrase, so this is not another determiner. It's what is the category that signals noun phrases?
Preposition.
Yep. So it's a preposition. And then we're getting to should. What is that? Auxiliary, right? Because here's be, and be is now a main verb, so that's the verb in the sentence. And then we have to, which is now not a preposition because test is not a noun phrase. What is test doing here? It would be a verb. Should be to test. And then this to, it's tricky because it is like the preposition to, but it's not a to. In this case, it's called an infinitival, if I could reach up there, infinitival verbal particle. So it's got a long name. But the main thing is to remember it's not a preposition, it's a particle. So it signals that a verb is coming, or if it's a verb, then it can't be a preposition. Okay, let's move on. We're doing this very basic analysis now, just identifying what these words are. And your would be labeled as, okay, what is skills? Skills is a noun, therefore your is determiner. Right? It's a possessive pronoun functioning as a determiner. And then we have in, which is preposition. Then we have the, which is, yes, thank you. And because we've got a determiner, we will have sooner or later a noun. Identification is a noun. Then we have of. Again, it's a preposition. And lexical would be adjective. And then we have categories, which is a noun. Yes. Okay, so we have here is, if we were to draw a syntax tree, a phrase structure tree of this long sentence, it wouldn't quite fit in this space here. But at the bottom of it, we would have a string of these lexical categories. We would have what is called a terminal string, which would consist of this kind of structure: determiner plus noun plus preposition plus determiner plus noun plus auxiliary plus verb plus particle plus verb plus determiner plus noun plus preposition plus determiner plus noun plus preposition plus adjective plus noun. That would be the terminal string, and then the individual words would come under there. When you look at files 5.5, for instance, you will see those syntax trees. And this is not really much helpful in order for us to understand how this sentence works, what the structure of this sentence really is. So what we need to do is to try to figure out which words in this longish sentence belong together meaningfully. Okay, so if you start to look for chunks in this particular sentence which belong together, that are semantically meaningful, obviously semantically, and that belong together structurally in terms of their grammar, what would be the first chunk that you identify there? Which words belong together? It doesn't, it needs to belong together with something else. Determiners don't appear alone. So, which words would you start putting into one phrase? Would you take this one? Intention? Does it belong together with the? Yes. What about of this exercise? Would that belong together? Also, yes. And this, in fact, forms the first big phrase in the sentence, a very meaningful phrase. And because its most important word is the noun, it's called a noun phrase. So the noun phrase, the intention of this exercise is a meaningful, it's semantically important category, it's semantically important chunk of words in this sentence, and it has a syntactic function also, because a grammatical function, because it is the subject of this sentence, right? So it's the subject of the sentence, and then everything else will be what you probably remember from junior high was called the predicate of the sentence. And we will look at it here in its grammatical, syntactic, structural terms, and we will call it a phrase. So what is the most important part of that phrase that forms the predicate of this sentence? Intention, should be, right? The verb, and that's why it's called the verb phrase. And then, you know, the rest is complements to the complement to this verb. It is a transitive. It is not a transitive verb. It's a be verb. Sorry, but it requires a complement here, which is a subject complement actually. To be, should be, and then should be what, to test the skills in your skills in the identification of lexical categories. So that would be what is traditionally in traditional grammar called the subject complement, and it's a little bit complicated here. But anyway, the point here is that when we see a string of different lexical categories put in a row, it doesn't really tell us much about the structure, but our brain still understands this structure. And this is what is called these chunks that I've been referring to with the non-technical vocabulary chunk. They are called in linguistics, in the study of grammar, they're called constituents. And constituents have to do with the hierarchical structure of the sentence, that the words are not equal, all words in the sentence are not equal with regard to each other. They belong together with some words more closely than with some other words. And that's why the first chunk here, the first constituent, is the noun phrase, the intention of this exercise. Okay, and then we can find other chunks here. Should be is obviously the main verb phrase, and then we have this nominal. This to test your skill. It's a nominal chunk, and we won't get into that. If you take the grammar course, you'll get more into what we call all these kinds of elements. Should be something. Should be to test your skills in the identification of lexical categories. But within this, after the particle and the verb, we have another chunk here, your skills, and not just your skills, but your skills in the identification of lexical categories. So we have another phrase here, which is what kind of a phrase? Your skills in the identification of lexical categories. What is the main, what is the head of that phrase that we are looking at? What is the most important word there? In your skills in the identification of lexical categories. Skills, yes. That is the head of this phrase because it's a noun. The entire phrase is a noun phrase, so another NP, okay? And then we can see just really quickly that here we have a determiner, a noun, and then there's a post modifier to skills. What kinds of skills? Skills in the identification of lexical categories. So it's followed by a prepositional phrase in the identification of lexical categories, and that's a PP prepositional phrase. So we can have prepositional phrases in noun phrases modifying, post-modifying the nouns. So of course it's not an obligatory category, it's an optional category, so we can put it in parentheses, but here the prepositional phrase in the identification of lexical categories, what kinds of skills, it's modifying the head noun, post-modifying it because it comes afterwards. So we're kind of like expanding our noun phrase rule, so we can have an adjective, optionally. Noun must be there. That's the only really obligatory element there. And then we can have a prepositional phrase following. We can have even a sentence, an entire sentence following. If it's a relative clause, it can post-modify the noun. For instance, your skills which help you to identify lexical categories, that would be a relative clause. But we won't get very deeply into those kinds of things. But what is important here is to see that the whole long sentence is not just a string of words. It's a string of words that that form these constituents that are meaningful and syntactically important. So in the identification of lexical categories, we have a prepositional phrase, and the most important word in the prepositional phrase is its head, which is the preposition, right? And then a prepositional phrase, it always, obligatorily, it has to have a noun phrase following it. So inside the prepositional phrase, we have a noun phrase, so it's getting crowded here, but a prepositional phrase, this is the rule for the prepositional phrase. It consists of a preposition and a noun phrase, always. And then the noun phrase has its own rule, and the noun phrase can have a post-modifying prepositional phrase inside it, and then a prepositional phrase can have a noun phrase. It will always have a noun phrase inside it, which can have a prepositional phrase inside it, and this is when we get to the notion of recursiveness of language. That a structure can include a structure which can include the original structure, and this can go on forever. And this is one of the really important things, because that means that the kinds of sentences we can create are infinite in number, and they can be as long as we can, our imagination allows and time allows. So there are practical constraints for how long these kinds of categories, these kinds of structures can embed other structures, which then embed the original structure, and on it goes. So it's just one of the ways when we've mentioned that with a handful of rules, we can create an infinite number of structures. That is what this means, that this is one of the features of how we can do this, the recursiveness of language, that we can have these structures. Sometimes I refer to the constituent structure of sentences as the kind of like the onion layered structure of a sentence. We have a big structure, this whole thing, this entire long sentence is of course where we start from, and that's referred to as the S. So that's the first rule. The S, the sentence or clause, it consists of two parts always, a noun phrase and a verb phrase, which traditionally you probably have been referring to as the subject and the predicate of the sentence. And these are the structural forms of the subject and predicate. Subject and predicate are the functions of the noun phrase and the verb phrase. And so sometimes one of my students said, don't refer to it as an onion layered structure because that makes us cry. But anyway, no, it's kind of fun, I think. So this is the first syntax rule from which we start. When we start analyzing the sentence, we kind of find what is doing what, or who is doing what. So these are the big chunks within the sentence. And then, of course, we need rules for the noun phrase, and we've kind of opened up the noun phrase here. And then in your book, you've got a list of these rules also for the verb phrase, and the verb phrase has some variation depending on what kind of a verb the verb is. Is it a transitive verb? Is it an intransitive verb? Is it a be verb, which would be a linking verb, and so on. So, but back to the notion of the constituent. What is a constituent? How do we define a constituent? By the way, we didn't analyze this fully, because in the prepositional phrase, in the identification of lexical categories, we've got this long noun phrase there, the identification of lexical categories, which consists of a determiner and a noun and a prepositional phrase after it. So here is the prepositional phrase, which post-modifies the noun identification. What kind of identification? Identification of lexical categories. So we have this really long noun phrase, which includes a prepositional phrase, which includes, of course, a noun phrase, which includes the prepositional phrase. So you get the idea that this can create those long sentences. But here's the definition of the constituent. So it's a syntactic unit that functions as part of a larger unit within a sentence. Typical constituents are noun phrase, main verb phrase, like in our sentence, should be main verb phrase, prepositional phrase, clause. You know, if you have like a relative clause, adjectival clause, or an adverbial clause within a sentence, and adjective phrase would be another one, adverb phrase too. So adjective phrase or adverb phrase. So these are typical constituents, but a constituent is also, the entire sentence, of course, is a constituent also, because the constituent has two characterizations. It needs to be semantically coherent, and it needs to be structurally, semantically coherent and also structurally coherent, have a structural function in a sentence. So it's a semantically coherent means that it's got meaning. Like if we have a sentence like, the little boy is sleeping. The little boy is semantically meaningful, right? We can replace it by he, and that shows also that it's a constituent. But it's also structurally meaningful because the little boy is sleeping. The little boy is the subject of that sentence, the subject noun phrase of that sentence. So that's the constituent. And one important thing is that the entire sentence is the largest constituent within the sentence. Because of this semantic coherence, a sentence is typically semantically coherent, and it's a structural unit. So let me change this to structural unit within the sentence. That's a better way of characterizing the structural importance of constituents. So the sentence itself is the largest constituent within a sentence. And what then might be the smallest constituents in a sentence? Those would be the individual words, because words are also meaningful. Even if they are function words, they would be grammatically meaningful. So the intermediate constituents then are these phrases. And that's where we sometimes are kind of like, what is a phrase? Where does this particular word belong to? What other words does it belong to? So identifying the phrases is sometimes something we need to kind of like think about, and that's why there are tests in order to figure out what words belong together into, for instance, in a noun phrase or another kind of phrase. Okay, so I think it's time to go, and I will post something on Friday about the tests that we use in order to figure out what the constituent structure of the sentence is. And there's also an exercise for Friday for you to do online, and also the answers for the exercise. So you have a good rest of the week. Thanks for coming. Bye.